We're joined today on INSEAD Knowledge by Lourdes Casanova, a lecturer in strategy at INSEAD. Professor Casanova, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
In your new book, Global Latinas, Latin America's Emerging Multinationals, you talk about the recent rise of what you call global Latinas. The rise of global Latinas has been overshadowed by the economic miracles that have been performed in Asian countries, China and India and the other Asian tigers. I'd like to start by asking you what you mean, why you call them global Latinas, and how are they different from multi-Latinas, which you also talk about in your book?
The aim of this research was, first of all, to celebrate the success of Latin America and Latin America's emerging multinationals. As you were saying, India and China have stolen the limelight, and Latin America has been very successful since 2002, and we have mainly heard about China and India. So the Inter-American Development Bank with INSEAD started a research, 1.5 years research, on finding out more about these multinationals. We looked at not only the big ones, Petrobras, Vale, Cemex, Grupo Bimbo, Televisa, but also medium-sized companies that have been very successful internationally, such as Polytech, an IT company in Brazil, Viña Concha y Toro, a wine company in Chile, Pollo Campero, a restaurant chain that is facing competition from Kentucky Fried Chicken, or the other way around, Kentucky Fried Chicken is facing competition from them, a Guatemalan company. And so we wanted to look at companies that had succeeded in the developed world, so in Europe, in the US, or in Asia. Why? Because there is some kind of coming of age when a company goes public in the New York Stock Exchange or in some of the European stock markets, when a company succeeds in a major acquisition in US or in Europe. This company is considered one of the main companies in the world, one of the main multinationals. Also because emerging markets growth is volatile on the one hand, and on the other hand, if we look at GDP per capita in the US or in Europe, even today, is much, much higher than the GDP per capita in those countries. So sometimes in certain sectors, 1% growth in the US is the equivalent to 20% growth in Latin America. So these companies, if they want to compete in the international arena, have to make it in US or in Europe. That's why. So the idea of changing the name from multi-Latinas that were sometimes very successful regional companies in Latin America, the idea was to focus on those who have made it in the US or in Europe or in Asia. That's why global Latinas. That's why they changed it in name.
To reflect the global status rather than the regional status of theirs.
Yes.
How does their success of the global Latinas compare to the Chinese and Indian companies that have also been successful globally?
In general, these are very old companies. Some of them are more than 100 years old, so have been there forever and have been very successful in their domestic markets. These companies in the 1990s, after what was called the lost decade of Latin America, when Latin American countries defaulted from their sovereign debt, the IMF and the World Bank came to the rescue of those, of basically all Latin American countries, and imposed what was called the Washington Consensus. So privatization of state-owned companies, deregulation, the falling of tariffs, and then these companies all of a sudden faced very strong competition in their home markets. So the idea of these companies is that they wanted to survive, they don't want to give up. That's one of their characteristics, and that's why they said we have to go abroad. The best defense is to attack. That was the idea. In the meanwhile, there is a very important year that we are seeing right now the consequences. That is 1989, the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That year marked the entrance of half the population of the world that had been under the communist rulers all over the world. Even now, some of them are still today considered communist countries, but all countries entered the market economy. All countries in the world started competing with each other. So that happened after 1989. I want to give you an example of how Latin America was affected. If we look at coffee, the second biggest trading commodity in the world right after oil, if we look at coffee, around 1990, the World Bank gave a major funding to Vietnam. Vietnam started growing coffee in an important scale. And then, all of a sudden, Latin American coffee growers faced very strong competition from Vietnam, completely unexpected to them. And that made Vietnam as the second biggest coffee exporter of the world, right after Brazil, displacing Colombia. So Colombian coffee growers and Central American coffee growers faced the strong competition from Asia very early on. And actually, the coffee prices around the 90s went down as a result of this competition. So this competition was faced very early on also from Mexican companies. China displaced Mexico as the second biggest trade partner in 2003. Biggest trade partner of the US, Canada, second Mexico for many years after Mexico signed the free trade agreement with US and Canada in 1994. So, as I said, Mexico again faced this competition very early on. Right now, both Indian companies, Chinese companies, and Latin American companies want to be major players in the world. The situation has changed. In countries such as Brazil, what they want to do is, in the rest of Latin America, to see China as a source of inspiration, as a source of knowledge. I'll give you another example. India started this association of IT companies called NASSCOM in the 1990s. And right now, if we think of outsourcing, if we think of the best IT companies in the world, definitely we'll be mentioning Wipro, we'll be mentioning Infosys, we'll be mentioning Tata Consultancy Services, companies that were completely unknown a couple of years ago. IT companies in Brazil, we looked, as I mentioned at the very beginning, one of them, Polytech, were completely unknown. Even today, they don't have much of a brand outside Brazil. We, in general, are not aware that financial companies, banks in Brazil, are extremely heavy users of IT, of technology. The strength of the Indian companies I just mentioned is mainly providing technology to banking sector in the US, while these technology companies in Brazil, some of them 50 years old, have been providing technology to Brazilian banks that are among the most advanced in the world in using technology, have been providing governments, regional governments, and the Brazilian government have been providing technology in e-government, voting, also in taxes. So most of the Brazilians submit their tax forms online. And these companies have this know-how, and they don't have a branding outside Brazil. So now Brazil has started, 3 years ago, an association of IT companies called Brascom. The idea was to learn what NASSCOM had done for Indian IT companies to do the same for Brazilian companies. So this has helped to put IT companies in Brazil together and to see ways to do some outsourcing, also to become like outsourcers of choice outside Brazil.
When we think about Latin America, we often also think about the instability in the region, the economic, political crises, currency collapses. I mean, those must have been difficult challenges for these companies to overcome.
One of the reasons why these companies went abroad was to balance the instability of their home countries. Often, when we teach about internationalization in business schools, we tell our students that with internationalization, you increase risk. These companies saw internationalization as a way to balance the risk of their own markets. If we think 1994, the collapse of the peso in Mexico, the currencies can collapse like 100% in a month. The Argentinian peso in December 2001 collapsed by 300% between December 2001 and January 2002. Similar situation 97, 98 98, 99 in Brazil. Similar situations. So currencies collapse. Most of these big multinationals do have the results in US dollars. So it's not that the revenues in these companies collapse. The problem is that since you are giving the results in dollars and your own currency has collapsed, then you have all of a sudden your revenues disappear. So the idea was for these companies, and I'll give you the example of Cemex in 1992, they entered Spain. So they had access immediately to the Eurozone. And so Cemex was able to survive the 94 collapse of the Mexican peso and the Mexican economy with, in part, with the revenues they got from Spain. That was more stable at that time and provided access to more stable currencies. So that's the idea, to offset the problems that they have in their own markets.
Well, that brings us to the present day, because they look for stability in the international markets to make up for the instability back in their own region. But today, with the economic crisis, it's shown that there's instability internationally. So what do you foresee as the future for global Latinas?
This is the paradox. The paradox right now is that some of them, the best of the class, are the ones maybe suffering. Those with an overexposure to the US market, those with an overexposure to certain areas in Europe are the ones suffering the most. Those companies staying in their own markets, having still like sometimes 70 or 80%, let's say Petrobras, 70 or 80% of the revenues still are local. Those are doing better. That's the paradox. However, I would say two things. Number one, last week, China signed an agreement with Petrobras. The agreement was to give Petrobras 80 billion in credits, in loans, in exchange for oil at a fixed price. So that's a win-win situation for both countries, and definitely for Petrobras, that right now credit is not available anymore, or has been really quite dry lately. So then they have a line of credit open with one country, that is China, that has plenty of cash right now. So what we see right now in this crisis, we are at the beginning of the crisis, we don't know what will happen. Every crisis means change of power. So for me, definitely Chinese companies and China will come stronger from this crisis. And I would bet that some of the countries, and definitely some of the companies in my book, definitely will come stronger from this crisis. Because as I said, any crisis brings change of power, and definitely Brazil. And all Latin America still is in the positive side, definitely of the growth. While we see recession, a strong recession all over, and we are in the negative side in Europe and in the US, in Eastern Europe, the forecast, the latest IMF forecast, IMF forecast, are still for growth all over Latin America. So these companies have the possibility of growth in their home markets, and also the possibility of growth in other emerging markets. So we'll definitely see more South investments, as I gave you this example about Petrobras in China. We'll see more Latin American investments from these companies, so there are going to be opportunities. There are going to be, and definitely these companies, the ones that will be the winners in the medium and the long term, will be acquirers during this crisis, as they have done in the past. There is a company, America Mobile, for instance, a mobile company, one of the biggest in the world. They are mainly in Latin America, also in the US, definitely have been made plenty of acquisitions during past crises in the region. Definitely this crisis, there are going to be many opportunities, and definitely these companies are going to be buying and acquiring in scale.
Does the experience that the global Latinas had in overcoming adversity, is that that's going to be an advantage for them, I suppose, in the current adverse conditions?
Definitely. Another thing I've seen, we saw in the report I wrote with the Inter-American Development Bank and in the book, one thing I see is that these companies are very resilient with very strong leaders. Here we don't talk about CEOs that move every 6 months, every year, every 4 years. When you have unstable markets, you need to look at the short term, but you need to look also at the medium and the long term. So these companies have been very resilient companies, being able to survive in turbulent markets and in turbulent times. So definitely, this resilience will be very helpful during this crisis. So, and they can teach. Here in the West, sometimes we thought it was normal for Latin America or Brazil or Mexico to have this kind of crisis, and never thought that this type of crisis will happen to us. So I think if we look more at Latin America, how Latin America has survived a number of major crises and how these companies have survived, maybe there are a lesson of 2 for this current crisis.
Professor Casanova, thank you for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.